to the Hutt Valley Chamber of Commerce. I think I know most of you in the room, but I'm Helen Down, Chief Executive of the Hutt Valley Chamber, and we're really pleased to bring together this workshop tonight to look at some of the changes around the long-term plan suggested around development contributions for property development. So we've convened this workshop to ensure that the business community is aware of one of these key changes, because I think it's really relevant to business. And so some of our promotion around the workshop is just to make people aware that it's out there and to bring attention to that, and to have an opportunity to provide some feedback and some perspective on the policy and what it may mean for business, or what we think it might mean just for our business or our part of the sector in Lower Hutt, and to provide that feedback and have that discussion with Hutt City Council and work together to come to something that is going to be useful for us all. So a warm welcome to you all, and some special guests this evening. Hutt City Councillor Josh Briggs is here at the back. If you don't know, Josh elected last election, weren't you, Josh? Yeah. And Hutt City Growth Manager Gary Craig, and Wendy Moore is Head of Strategy and Planning, and Dwayne Fletcher is our guest as well. So Dwayne has a company called Vale Consulting and provides a lot of consultancy work around local government. So, you know, is an expert in this policy space, and is really pleased, Dwayne, that you come and spend the evening with us and give us your insight behind the development of this policy. And I'd also like to make a special welcome to our ex-mayor and mayoress, Linda Goss-Wallace and Ray Wallace. Lovely to see you both again this evening. So today we've brought together some key people for you from Hutt City Council to share the proposed policy. So if you haven't read it all, this will save you a bit of time and give you a good understanding of what it includes, and for you to have direct access to give your thoughts of what it means for business. And as you probably know, the Hutt Valley Chamber of Commerce and Hutt City Council work really closely together on a wide range of topics, and our role is to make sure the business community is very well aware of things that are happening in the city that are important to business, and that we provide that avenue for a voice. So, you know, often I sit on a lot of all sorts of advocacy type Zoom meetings or in-person meetings, whatever, and we're often the only business perspective in that meeting. And I find that quite alarming at times, and it's really important that business has a say on some of the major decisions that get made in this region and nationally, you know, when it comes to investment or spend, that sort of thing. So I'd also like to acknowledge Silver Partners, Dave Morgan. Dave is our Vice President as well, from our Chamber as well, and is Silver Partner with Link Business Wellington. And the Chamber team, so you may not have met our new Chamber team recently, so Raywin is here. Raywin Langford does all our digital marketing, all our comms, anything on the web, huge amount of work there. Fiona, who you may have met at the door as well, does all our financial management, our accounts and project management. And Amanda Walters as well is our education to employment consultant and coordinator. So she works with all young people, getting them into local jobs. You know, I know you've been flooded by young people today, haven't you, Amanda? So all looking for apprenticeships and work experience, which is a key part of the work we do. A little bit of housekeeping. Bathrooms are through in the stairway. If you haven't been here since last year, they are done a 180-degree turn, so the men's now on the riverside and the ladies on the city side. Evacuation procedures, drop cover, hold, and earthquake, and if there's another emergency, we'll meet in the car park over there as well. Can I ask you to just check your phones are on silent? And just to note that we are going to live stream the presentation, so that we've got people who've emailed us who can't come tonight who do want to watch the live stream and want to see what the outline of the policy is as well. So, and there'll be photos taken as well. So the purpose of the event such as this is to ensure the business community has a voice, and that as business people we get to express our opinion and our perspectives. And the Chamber is pleased to bring together a range of some of the most senior and most expert stakeholders across a whole range of topics. And this one's really important, probably one we haven't done a lot of in the last few years around property development, but really, really important when you look at what's happening in this city and in this valley. And we have identified transport and infrastructure as one of our key planks for the next 3 years. I don't know if you noticed the announcement today on stuff about transport investment. and roading. So, you know, as a business community, we need resilient, reliable and cost-effective infrastructure, and we need good things like good roading and property development and, you know, basic things like water and electricity. So we put a lot of effort into that. So the way this evening will work is Dwayne will speak to us and give us an overview of the policy and what the key points are, and we'll do a short question and answer session after that. And then we're going to break into 2 work streams. So we'll just split down the middle, got some post-it notes and 2 easels at the bottom to look at specific areas of the policy, and Gary and Wendy will help with one each of the work groups and get your feedback on those specific areas, and then we'll share that as a group. So everyone gets to have the opportunity to have a say, and you know, if you've got a perspective, then please share that with us as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dwayne. Dwayne, thank you for coming this evening, and we look forward to hearing from you now.
Good, thank you. I'll just bring up the presentation. Right, kia ora koutou, good evening everybody. I'm Dwayne Fletcher, as been introduced. I do have a company called Vale Consulting, and I help councils with development contributions policies, like the one we're going to talk about tonight. And just so you know where I come from, the Department of Internal Affairs developed a guide and a template for DCs last year, and I was the principal author on that. So this is an area I do know quite a bit about. Happy to field any questions as we go nearer through the night, and again as we go through the workshop session. Just before we get into the presentation though, up here, if some of your questions are answered by the end of the evening, there's a little frequently asked question sheet just up here, so you feel free to take that and go through that in your own time to hopefully cover some of the questions you might have. And I guess a plug for the long-term plan process that Hutt City Council is going through. This document will be on the web. There will be hard copies undoubtedly in the administration building at the council. There's a section at the back that makes it easy for you to submit on this policy should you wish to. Right. I'll finish mine. Right, so the purpose of the presentation and workshop tonight. Well, the council has a proposed development contributions policy, and what we're going to do tonight is we're going to walk you through, not all of it, there's a lot in there. We're going to talk to you about the key changes between the old policy and the new policy, so what's really relevant for what's proposed for the next 10 years. And we do want to seek some of your feedback, which we fed into the consideration deliberation process for council. In terms of the background, look, I used to work for Hutt City Council 8 years ago. When I left 8 years ago, it was a very different environment to the one you see today. I'm sure it's obvious that all of you who are involved in the property sector, Hutt City is booming, and that's great. There are some implications for council and that kind of growth. The council needs to meet that growth with investment in infrastructure, and there's a cost to doing that. You know, so you'll see some figures in a moment, but the council's proposing to lift investment and growth-related infrastructure to meet that challenge across the board. And it's got to fund that somehow, and development contributions are the main way in this country that councils try to recover from development, the cost of development. And in this case, the council is reviewing its DC policy as part of its long-term plan. It has to be done as a minimum every 3 years. They are sequenced in, which makes sense that it fits in with the long-term plan and infrastructure projects that are in there. Right, in terms of the major changes to the policy, the first thing is, if you are familiar with the old policy, the new policy won't look like the old one. The Department of Internal Affairs developed a template last year, and the Hutt City Council policy 99% follows that template. It's a very good template. Oh, I had a hand in it. But it makes it very easy to navigate. The way I like to describe it is what the builder needs to know up front, what the builder's lawyer needs to know is at the back. So, you know, it's really customer focused, and you'll find it much easier to find out what you want to do if you just want to get on and do your business. In terms of the key changes, we've got calculations, and we're going to talk about these 2 areas tonight, the calculations and the charges, and administration of the policy, because they both matter in terms of what it means for your developments. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail for the most part. The only thing I don't think we really go into is the funding model a lot. And that's essentially when we take all the calculations, the projects and the calculations, and we look at how over time inflation and interest costs, because council draws down debt to fund this stuff, affects the charges. And all you need to know at the moment is the councils use a product that's used by several other councils to help with that calculation. Previously it was done in spreadsheets, so that's an improvement. I glossed over this a little bit before, and this is just some headline stats. The council's looking at household growth of 7% over 10 years, 14% over 20, and roughly that kind of trend heading out to 30 years as well. If you look at Hutt City Council's forecast growth, the highest areas of growth are the valley floor and Wainui-a-Mata. And you'll see in terms of some of the infrastructure that's proposed, there's a very strong link with that. From a business perspective, we've used the housing and business assessment required for the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and that has an assumption of no net business, that should be gross floor area, for Hutt City over the next 20 years. So your building footprint will look much the same, it just may be used more intensively, and that's what the assumption is here. It flows through, so all the assumptions in the long-term plan are linked through this policy. In terms of the infrastructure program, there's a much more focused growth program in the three waters. So Wellington Water have been busy looking at the projected growth and then figuring out what that means for water, for wastewater and for stormwater. And the projects that were there already, they are expected to cost a lot more. Wellington Water went through a process a couple of years ago of redetermining how they were going to estimate costs. And it's a more robust process, but it also means those costs are probably more accurate, they also mean they're higher. So those costs have flowed through into the new calculations. You've got an expansion of the growth-funded transport project, so previously the Cross Valley Connector was in there and not much else. One of the ways the council intends to meet the challenge of growth is by enabling more use of the existing corridors for other transport modes, active travel. So you'll see that there are walking and cycling projects and lots of small projects around minor works, making the roads safer for pedestrians and cyclists that are feature as part of their program for growth. And there's also a much better scope of the works for Wainui-a-Mata, where Wellington Water have done the most work over the last few years in terms of determining what's needed for growth. And here are just some headline stats. Hopefully you can see that. What this says, and I'll take you to the last column here, which is the total for the 4 activities that we recovered development contributions for: water, wastewater, stormwater and transport. It essentially says there's a program, and that program's worth $506 million, and some aspects of that program are attributable to growth. When you come down through here, what it says is $117 million of that $506 million program is attributable to growth, and most of that is going to be sought from DC funding. You might be wondering why there's a difference. That's NZTA subsidy for the most part, because the council gets a subsidy on its work, and it'll deduct that from the amount it tries to recover from developers. And you can see here, that means only roughly 20% of your headline figures for those projects that wholly or partially relate to growth are trying to be recovered from DCs. And there's a little bit of magic that happens with that funding model I talked about before, with inflation and interest costs, and that bumps it back up to 115. So approximately $115 million is to be sought via development contributions over the next 30 years. Some of these projects will be funded over the next 10 years, some of them have a longer life. And so council seeks to recover funds for that project over a longer life. I think it's worth just pointing out a couple of the bigger items in that program. Citywide, you've got wastewater storage at the Seaview wastewater treatment plant, and that's programmed at approximately $21 million. The intention of that project is to be able to provide for an existing issue that you have there, as well as for growth, and it's meant to mean fewer discharges into the Waifatu. The Cross Valley Connector at 198, and that's actually, I think, 3 or 4 actually kind of related excuse me, programs, but the total cost being $198.3 million. And I'm sure you're familiar with the middle crossing part, but there's also, I think there are public transport improvements, a new road linkage in Gracefield as well. On the valley floor, there's, I think it's a 8,000 cubic metre reservoir being planned up near Nainai, and a main coming away from it to feed growth in the valley floor. And the combined value of those works is about $37 million. And roughly half of that reservoir, around 4,000 cubic metres, is for growth. The other 4,000 is for an existing level of service efficiency. So the council has a target of how much storage it wants for every household in the valley floor, and part of the cost of that reservoir is to, or part of the purpose of that reservoir is to bring that storage up to meet that expectation. I think most of you are familiar with the work Wellington Water did around, an earthquake and how much storage you need, so that's part of the driver for that project. In Wainui and Marta, I mentioned there's been quite a bit of work scoped out. They also have an 8,000 cubic metre reservoir planned. Again, it's 50% for existing residents, or 4,000 cubic metres, and 50% for growth, roughly being 1 cubic metre of storage for growth over the next 30 years, factored into that. And again, there are mains and other works land acquisition that go into that cost. Black Creek, there's actually a wider Black Creek program, but this particular part is clearing out, I think, some of the northern end of Black Creek to provide for some additional flow and storage capacity up that end, primarily that northern growth area. And wastewater reticulation pumping, look, I'm pretty sure most people are aware of the fact that that network has been under strain for some time. There's storage, there's new pumping mains, there's new pumping stations, there's new reticulation going in, all of that. Some of it's to deal with existing issues, quite a lot of it's to deal with growth, and the wastewater discharge expected as a result of that. So you can see just out there, there's quite a few big ticket items in that 500 million that we talked about before. This is quite a busy table. It felt really logical when I put it up, but it's really hard for you to understand what's going on. What it's trying to do is show you across the different catchments and the different activities that you charge DCs for, what the current charge is and what the proposed charge is. I'll probably just focus on a few headline items to make it simple. Two places are going up, two catchments are going up substantially, the valley floor and Wainui and Marta. And you saw that infrastructure before, and I hope you can get a sense of why. So in the valley floor, for example, excluding GST, the development contribution across all activities is around $4,000, and that's rising to just under $13,000. In Wainui and Marta, the current charges for all activities are around $4,000, excluding GST, and that's rising to around $22,000. And the rest of the table just shows you, breaks it down by those individual catchments and activities, and talks about, in net terms, what the difference is between the old and the new charges. There is one area that's going down in charges, and that's Eastbourne, and that's because Wellington Water and the council have taken out a reservoir that was planned for the eastern base, and because of taking it out, it's no longer needed to be recovered from. There's only, I think, 30 homes or something like that projected for a decade or two, and Wellington Water assessed that the existing reticulation reservoir will meet that demand, so that project's dropped out. As a consequence, their charges have dropped from, it's on the other side there, around $15,000 to just under $7,000. This is all excluding GST, so please add 1.15, 15% times by 1.15 to get your GST inclusive numbers. So you might be wondering how that compares to other councils. These bars here, they show the low and the high charges at Hutt City at the moment compared to what's proposed. And you can see, hopefully the little light blue can be seen, but roughly you're talking $5,000 for your lowest charge, bumping up to around $7,000 for your lowest charge under the new policy. The purple bar says what your highest charge is at the moment, and you can see it's actually Eastbourne. And that's actually changing to Wainui, but it's going up substantially. So that range, the difference between the bars shows the range. What you can see here is a whole bunch of other councils and their range as well, their lowest charge and their highest charge. And I can just point out this is all GST exclusive, and only for those councils that charge water, wastewater, stormwater and roading, so it's kind of comparable. Because not all councils charge for the same activities. I think what I'd probably point out most is that neither the current charges or the proposed charges are really too different from the sector across, a smattering of councils across the country. At the current rate here of, maximum of 22, you're kind of middle range in terms of those peaks. What I can't show you is what those councils are proposing now, because they're all going through the same exercise. High growth has been a feature across most of these councils, and they'll be doing the same thing that Hutt City will be doing, looking at forecast growth, the infrastructure needed to service it, and what their future DC charges will need to be to pay for that growth. There's only two places I could get, because the rest are either they're doing their DC policy out of sequence with the long-term plan, or they're starting after the long-term plan in a couple of cases. So I can talk about Palmy. Palmerston North has increased both their low and their high range. So at the moment, if you can see here, their low range is around 6 and their high is around 10. And so their future low charge is going to be 9,000 and their future high charge is going to be around 29,000. So, and Tasman District Council, the other council I can talk about, their range has widened. Their charge is actually, their lowest charge has actually dropped to 10 grand, but their highest charge has gone up to about 29. Very similar actually to Hutt City as it happens. So what I'd say there is that, I think Hutt City compares reasonably favourably. It's certainly not top price in terms of its DC charges. What you don't know is what the rest of the council's going to do. Those two early indications suggest that the higher end of the range is probably going to lift in a couple of councils. So those are the growth costs. The council's got a couple of ways of how it can fund it. The proposal is growth pays for growth in a principle, and that's what the DC policy does at the moment, bar for the NZTA subsidies. The alternative is essentially growth infrastructure is paid for in one other way, so either partly funded through rates and partly funded through DCs, or entirely funded through rates. And that's the first decision council needs to make, and the decision it needs to make when it has concluded consultation, to stick with its plan, growth pays for growth. And the next one is if you decide to use DCs, it's got to figure out how it divvies up those costs. So infrastructure spreads over different suburbs. Some infrastructure serves the whole city, some of it a few streets really. And the council needs to decide, at what level does it want to aggregate its catchments. The more catchments you have, arguably in some cases fairer, because you've got a closer link between the projects that you pay for and the projects you receive a benefit from. Also it gets way more complex and you get a degree of artificial precision. The wider you go out, the more stable charges are, but arguably the less connection, there's a link between the individual project and your development. So council has to kind of weigh off those competing objectives when it looks at how it spreads the costs and where it decides to create the catchments. At the moment, they've decided to leave the catchments as they stand. There is a change though, that transportation, which was previously broken up, will now be a citywide catchment. You might think why? Well, it's because the calculations under the old catchment actually just prorated everything out to the catchments anyway. So it was effectively a citywide charge without appearing to be one. So rather be transparent. Those are the charges and how we got to where they are. There are some changes to the policy administration that do matter. The first is there's a whole new trigger notice invoice and payment process contemplated in the new policy, and this is meant to make things clearer. When you're going to get an assessment, which is a notice, when you're going to get an invoice, and when you're going to need to pay. At the moment, it seemed a little ambiguous in parts of the policy, and you're not entirely clear at any point in time what needs to happen. So that's just to make everything clearer, and it's consistent with the national guidance and the national template. It introduces the DC notice concept rather than, I think you guys have given a quote. The notice is important because that's the language of the Act, and also your rights for a reconsideration or an objection hinge off that notice. So it's much clearer about when your rights to object to your DC notice or your DC assessment is lodged. And there are some changes to payment times. Nothing big for all the subdivisions or the building consents, they will remain as they are. But for service connections, for consents other than subdivisions, so land use consents for example, potentially, And service connections, basically the policy states when you'll be required to pay, and for the most part it brings it forward compared to now. And look, it's in the policy, but essentially it's probably not going to apply to 99% of people, most of these instances here. The other thing is the policy just really makes it clear, and this is provided for in legislation, but it makes it clear to people who read the policy that if you don't pay, council can chase you. There are other statutory powers the council has if you don't pay, but this is a last resort power. One of the things that the council's tried to do is recognise that, the need to provide for smaller homes, and that smaller homes also have less of an impact on some infrastructure services, and so that should flow through into the charges. So what you've got here is a bedroom-based policy that dictates, what charges you pay. Essentially, if you're building a 3 or 4 or 5 bedroom home, you're just going to pay the usual development contribution rate. But if you build a 1 or 2 bedroom home, you're going to get a discount. If you build a 1 bedroom home, what it says essentially is you'll be charged half the amount you normally would. And if you build a 2 bedroom home, you'll be charged 75% of what you normally would. That's essentially what that policy does. If you build an extra bedroom later on, well, we'll catch you as well, it's got rules around that. But essentially it tries to make a fairer relationship between the charge we levy and the kind of demand you're going to place on the infrastructure. The bonus is that hopefully it'll incentivise more smaller dwellings, the kind of dwellings that our young people need and our old people as they want to downsize. There's also a couple of other things. Retirement villages and visitor accommodation, they've just been standard at a half charge, if you like, or a half EHU, because at the moment the policy doesn't specify what it is, and it just makes it clearer. So if you're a retirement village developer, you know what you get charged. And there are rules in there that relate to legislation around whether you're a retirement village provider or not. So not everyone can claim to be a retirement village operator, by the way. In terms of the assessment rates, we've also changed the non-residential rates. And a few other features around non-residential development, so commercial, industrial, retail, that sort of thing. At the moment, the policy is silent on what happens if you do a commercial subdivision. So what we've just put in is a standard 1 EHU, or equivalent to 1 household charge. At that point, when your building consent comes through, your land use consent comes through, council will reassess, you'll get a credit for the one you've paid, and they'll figure out what the rest of the charge is. We've also changed it to a format which is an EHU per 100 square metres of, should be gross floor area. And that just makes it easier for you and your surveyors and your professionals to figure out what you're going to be charged. So if you're building a 1,500 square metre commercial development, the math is way easier by the way the figures are being developed now compared to what it was. It really doesn't change the charges in of itself too much, but it makes it easier to calculate. In the conversion, though, it has changed the figures ever so slightly. So, for example, these are the transport EHU assessment rates per 100 square metres. And what we've got here is, at the moment, if you've got 100 square metres of industrial development, you'll be charged 3.3 EHUs. Under the new policy, you'll be 4. With commercial, it's 2 to 3, and for retail, 10 down to 6. Now, the slight difference here is that we've sought information from traffic engineers about the kind of traffic demands different types of developments will generate, and the figures have been tweaked to reflect that. The other thing this does is it has a category for other non-residential. So not all non-residential developments are going to fit into those 3 categories, which now have definitions to support them. There is just some developments that just don't feature or don't fit in, but there are a halfway house potentially between residential and commercial, and this just says, look, we'll just do a special assessment, and there are some base demand measures in the policy that everyone can look at, and you make a fair assessment of the demand impact that then translates into charges. Special assessments are where the council and potentially developers can step away from the prescribed rates in the policy and basically look at the underlying infrastructure demand and make basically a special assessment of those demands and therefore how much they can be charged. All this says is that we're going to be more specific around when it's appropriate to use those special assessments, and the proposed rules are where the development is of a relatively large scale. So simply by scale, you might assume that you depart more from norms. The development is likely to have less than half or more than twice the demand for an activity of that type contemplated in the policy. A development, this is one we covered before, where basically it doesn't fit into all the boxes. Or if your development is going to use more than 5 cubic metres of water a day, and that's primarily non-residential development. And that's because, especially with industrial production, the amount of water a business can use can vary massively depending on what it is. So if you're some kind of fruit or food production enterprise, you're going to use a lot of water. If you're a warehouse storage, you're going to use very little. So this just says basically if you're a large, we'll take a bespoke assessment of it. Reconsiderations and objections. I think I mentioned before that the notice will be clear that it's the point in the process where if you don't like what you hear from council, that's where you can lodge your reconsideration and an objection. I won't go into the details of those two things, but just know they're different levels of objection really. And just requires a bit more process around that so it's cleaner and everyone can follow the audit trail. And it does require a payment. Those processes are quite expensive. I've been through 3 objections, including the first one in the country, and that cost the council that was working on that $150,000, and it cost the developer $180,000. So hopefully none of you end up in a situation like that. We won, by the way. But it can be very expensive. For the most part, the commissioners have been trying to keep the cost low, the process informal, and you might end up with a few $1,000s. I guess the point here is that council will incur a cost and it's asking a deposit from you before it goes down that road. And the only other thing it does is it again stresses the importance of that notice for the remissions that are in the policy, which have largely remained the same. A little bit boring perhaps, but the policy just has definitions to support all those new rules that we talked about. One for a bedroom, that is largely aligned with the national guidance, which is largely pinched from Hamilton City Council. A definition of commercial, retail, industrial, and those are aligned as much as possible with the national planning standards. So you don't get a big difference between what you're going to be subject to under the RMA and what you're going to be subject to in this policy. Again with the GFA, and we use a legislative definition for retirement village just to make sure that nobody and everybody claims to be a retirement village when they're not. Thank you for your patience. It was a quick run through of all the key changes.
So we've got about 5 minutes just for some initial questions and thoughts on the policy that Dwayne's outlined. Right?
Shall I kick it off?
Yes, you can.
Well done, Dwayne. Good presentation. It brings back the old days, 8 years ago, when you were standing doing that with the urban growth strategy. Can I just clarify, are you talking about particularly Wyoming and Marta, and we are seeing unbelievable growth there? Are you talking about those increases 1 July automatically, or are there going to be a staggered or staged increase?
Yep. So that's the most asked question I think we've had is when does this apply? So the policy applies from 1 July 2021, subject to council's deliberation and confirmation of the policy. But if you have a subdivision consent or a land use consent now, that consent is subject to the current policy. If you got it the last 2 years and 9 months, or whatever it might be. The legislation says the policy that applies is the policy that is in force at the time that you applied for your building or resource consent with full information. So that means pretty much if you've got it, it's locked in for that consent. Just want to stress that if you have a subdivision consent now, potentially the buildings that go on that subdivision consent might be subject to the new policy, what will translate as a credit. So if you are charged 1 EHU for a lot in that subdivision, then when the building consent guys go and look at your building, or your person who's built building on the property's building consent, they might well assess it under the current policy, but they'll give you a credit for the 1 EHU you give, so that'll net out. If you're developing a commercial development, though, it may not be that easy. You might get a credit for your 1 EHU that you've got at subdivision time, but they'll assess the building consent when it comes in under the new policy. So the theory is it sticks with the policy that is it for the consent when it was basically granted for the most part. but that doesn't preclude council looking at new consents on the land or the building under new policies. But credits will be given.
I'll just clarify though, when you're saying applications in prior to 1st of July, what happens if there's an application that goes in and there's a request for further information? If it's not full, did I pick up that you were saying it had to be fully consented by 1 July?
Yeah, no, so it's at the moment it's with full information, and the test I would recommend is, I think under the RMA is it being accepted for processing as opposed to has full information through the RFI process coming. So for example, you might submit an application and it's so deficient the council doesn't accept it to even consider. That would be accepted. If it was accepted for processing, they'll assess it. They may put an RFI, you may have to provide additional information, but the policy you're subject to should be the one before 1 July in that case.
But so after 1 July, it is that in one matter in particular, it is that 20 plus thousand,
22,000 plus GST. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Dwayne, when does the submission period close for the development contribution policy?
It closes on the 6th of May at 5 p.m.
Right, okay.
A week away.
Yeah, so it's not so far away. Yeah, lots of questions, lots of stuff to talk about on this, but I suppose probably one of our biggest problems, I'm a land surveyor, Councillors consultants, we've got a lot of resource consents. We're under enormous pressure at the moment from our clients who are obviously trying to beat the cost increases. And I've got staff working overtime, and it's not a healthy situation. It's not one that we want to be in at all, because we're already flat stick and we can't get more staff. This has created a huge bubble for us, and it's not only for us, but it's also for council staff. Where we have a lot of respect, a lot of time, and really good relationships with council staff. But we see they're already under enormous pressure and not able to perform to the prescribed deadlines. So we've got huge delays there. What this is going to do, if it all comes to pass on July 1, is just we've got a huge lot of consents, as other consultants do, and then there'll be some more massive delays at council, which is just not going to be very helpful. And it's a question that has been raised too, I think in the past, is why couldn't this be staged? Maybe it's over 2 years or something, and perhaps I need to put a submission in that. But has there any thought been given to that, just to sort of try and take a bit of the heat out of it, out of the and sort of reduce the size of that bubble?
Yeah, I might defer to Wendy for part of the answer, but I believe transition was one of the things that were considered in some of the earlier reports. Effectively, that means the difference would need to come from rates, and the council's had a previous policy where it did that. It's now facing a different future. It's got high growth, it's got a very expensive infrastructure bill, and no longer wants to provide those remissions. I guess what I would say is, at some point in time, a line is drawn in the sand, and some people are going to fall on one side of it, and some people are going to fall on the other. And it didn't matter whether we were transitioning this in 1 year or 2 years, that'll always be the case. But I might, if Wendy or Gary want to mention.
Just to add further to that is what Dwayne has said is right. We did have a remissions policy for 6 years, and at the end of 2018 that ceased. Council knew that they were going to have to review their development contributions, and in fact that's a point I'd make. They're reviewed every 3 years, they have to be. So we will be transitioning in, we will get to 3 years, and we will be looking at the policy again. So we'd always be in transition, which isn't a place that would be a good place for everybody to be. So what I'm saying is, every 3 years we do this. Every 3 years there's always going to be the risk that people will do what you're saying they're doing now. It will always happen like that. People will act in their own best interests. The issue with staff and council staff, I'll take that back with us and we'll talk about that, but I am aware that that the director of that particular area is fully aware of the pressure that is going on his staff, and also on the consultants that they're working with, and that they are making plans to be able to meet the demand that they're getting now.
Just one more brief comment, I don't want to take up too much time, but I think it's the size of the changes, especially in Wainui, which is a significant growth area at the moment, It's the size of those changes, and I'll just say it's probably due to lack of investment over the last 10, 20, 30 years. You know, and now our developers, you know, are having to, you know, to sort of go from here to here, and that's, you know, if we perhaps invested, no answer to this really, but if we'd invested more over the last 10, 20, 30 years, we wouldn't have such a massive jump.
Yeah, I mean,
That's the problem.
I think that's true, but also what is true is that the growth in Wainuiomata is growth that it hasn't seen since the 70s. So in terms of investment, I guess the elected councils made their decisions based on what the growth projections were for that area when they were doing the development contributions policy. And I think the first one was in, I don't know, 2008 maybe, was when it was brought in, and then we had our first policy in 2012.
Yeah.
So if you think about the history of that, then I mean, it's not my place to say whether the decision that was made to invest or not to invest was the right one, but I'm sure they had their reasons for
I guess you
doing
could say
it, as we have.
that developments up to now have probably paid less than they should have in development contributions because the assets weren't being invested in at the time.
The other assurance I can give you about fairness, I suppose, is that to the extent that existing developments have come and gone and they represent the fabric of the community there at the moment, they're paying for their level of service components of those projects through rates. Shared with everyone, I appreciate, but you know, only a portion of the projects attributable to future growth are trying to be recovered through this policy. So you're not being asked to take it back long.
I could come back on that one, but I won't.
Well, do so when we go into our work streams.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify. Did you suggest that, so if we paid a development levy at time of subdivision and the levies are obviously going to increase and we paid a reduced rate, that council will effectively be looking for a top-up at building consent stage?
It's around the unit of demand measure they use. So essentially, at a subdivision, you would have been assessed as, let's just call it household, one household for that lot, for a residential subdivision. And the charge associated with that one household lot might have been $2,000 at that point. The new policy says one house should be $8,000. It might well, the council might well reassess at building consent stage, but it will give you a credit at the household rate for 1-to-1. You won't have to pay any more. It won't require a top-up between that $2,000 and $8,000 difference. It will simply grant you a credit for the DC you've already paid and been assessed for. Yep. And that will always be the case regardless whether it's commercial or residential. What happens though is if the demand, when they reassess the development, if the demand is higher than what you paid for previously, they will reassess that net difference, and then in the new policy and the new charges will apply to that. So for example, you might have one lot, you subdivide it to two, they'll ask for another one at the new rate.
One more question?
Dwayne, as a developer here for many years, it seems like the fact of how much money we contribute to the council rates take never seems to be factored into it. We hear about the costs that we developers create in the system. We never kind of seem to get any kudos for the literally millions of dollars we create in rates revenue year on year, let alone the assets of millions of dollars we gift back, and the fact that we get taxed for that lovely process. So it always seems like developers get kind of this connotation that we're bad boys because we're creating demands on the systems, yet we get nothing in what I'm hearing. I don't see anything in your charts that suggests the offset will be the increase in rates, which must play that could actually be taken if someone was really truly wanting to could add that to the cost of services, increased cost of services. If they wanted to, the council would say, oh, all those rates that are coming in those developments could be contributed to it, and then there'll be no increase. So again, I'm just saying, it seems like we're always talking about extra cost, but we're not even talking about extra revenue. Has that been factored in anywhere?
Yeah, so first, I don't view developers as bad or good boys. You're simply a business conducting your business in a city or a district. The council, there's a cost that comes with your activity, and the council has to decide how it funds that cost. It's got this tool, it's also got there's financial contributions, and it's also got rates, basically as its primary tools for funding that. The council needs to decide how it shares that cost about. In this case, it's not seen as a penalty, it's just simply the cost of recovering the activity. So it's not a penal charge, but it's simply a charge associated with the cost of providing that infrastructure. The benefits, the spillover benefits you're talking about, in terms of the economy, the council can turn its mind to that and decide whether that's just part of the cost of doing business here. There are lots of businesses that generate economic wealth in the district, and not everyone gets a remit or a mission of some kind on their rates or whatever. So you all contribute to that. I guess the only other thing I'd say is that other people who've gone before have contributed either a financial charge or a development impact levy or a development contribution. They had different names in the past, and they've contributed that, and they are also ratepayers. And so it's not inconsistent with previous practice here in Hutt City or across the council country generally. It's just a way that council spreads its funding burden.
So it's a choice, isn't it?
It is a choice. Councils are not required to use development contributions, but they are required to fund their growth infrastructure somehow.
And would your charts, or could your charts be seen selective? Because there's no, from my understanding of the past, everything we've been charged for extra services was always never a full charge for those services. It was added to the rates demand that was needed to provide the services for the community as a whole. So some of those other councils could be at different stages in that process, couldn't they? So
they could well be, but that would suggest that those charges for those other councils are lower than they should be.
again, it's subjective without knowing all the information, isn't it?
Can I just, Tim, can I ask you a question and we'll break into our work groups to look at the different
Just
aspects of
curious
this?
about the levies for commercial and industrial property. So I noticed that industrial was 4 EHUs per 100 square metres, which intuitively seems heavy. The 5,000 litre complex industrial warehouse might have, is 50, isn't it? 50 EHUs, is that right?
Yeah, so take your square metres times by 4.
Yeah. So that warehouse might have 3 guys and 1 forklifts and 2 people in the office. Is there much science behind that, or is it?
Yeah, there is.
I know commercial and industrial property owners don't get very many votes. So
yeah, there is science behind it. We took this is information from Stantec and the traffic engineers at back it. But what I will say is that these are averages. Yeah, and there is a range in all of these. So, for example, food retail, I think there's something like 16 equivalent household units per 100 square metres. And other types of retail are 3 or 4. So there's an average, which is why the policy has that special assessment criteria that says basically if you're being grossly misassessed, if you like, you can say, look, I'm half, or you're probably not going to say you're double the demand, but you can say you're half of what would otherwise be the case normally, or assumed in the policy. Can we please do a special assessment? The onus will be on you to provide evidence to support that, but the council can take that into consideration. So, your 4 EHUs per 100 square metres might be 1.2 for a warehousing operation, depending on what that kind of warehousing operation is.
or half.
Or whatever it might be. The traffic assessment, which we would expect from a traffic engineer, would play that.
We have done that in the past, and particularly for warehouses, which typically have very few staff. You compare that to, say, an industrial factory, which might have significantly more staff. Yeah.
Okay, so can we now break into 2 work groups and we'll look at specific topics around this, so you all get to have feedback into all the things you're saying, Colin, that you'd like to have, and so we can all give some feedback into this. So we'll just split the room largely down the middle, and work group 1 will be facilitated by Wendy, and work group 2 facilitated by Gary, and Dwayne can float between the 2. And the first topic is around the catchment areas that Dwayne outlined, and the scope of the contributions and the remissions and credits. So what you think about those 3 topics, and we've got some whiteboard, some easels at the back with some post-it notes on it, so if you can put your points on those topics on that on your ESOL as a group and have a spokesperson who can then talk to those, that would be useful, because then we can collect that, because the Chamber's going to put in a submission on a long-term plan, and this will be part of your feedback tonight will be in helping us, informing us on what we should be including in that and what the perspectives are. So appreciate your contribution on there as well. Okay.